Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event with the title Broader Policies and Unauthorized Flows, Evidence from the Refugee Crisis in Europe. I am Mahdi Qudsi, and I am an economist from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Today's presenter is Francesco Fassani from Queen Mary University in London. And this presentation is also based on a paper that is co-authored with Mr. Frattini. He's also based in Milan. He's from the University of Milan. And actually, this event is part of the series seminars in international economics that we are organizing at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies in cooperation with the Research Center of International Economics, or FIW. And these seminars in international economics are intended to be a forum for presentations and discussion of current research findings in the field of international economics. And we mainly focusing on three major topics: international trade, FDI, migration, and more importantly, international trade policy. So in order to have the housekeeping, I have to say that we have usually a presentation about 40 minutes in the beginning. So we usually do not interrupt the presenter because we have the virtual seminars. So, but I asked Francesco, and Francesco said he's also he will be also able to answer some questions. So I think for that, if any participant would like to ask a question, you can simply raise your hand, and Francesco will hopefully see your raised hand, and you can ask your question. But if there is no question, we can collect and gather all questions for after the presentation is done. We will have about 20 minutes of presentation. And we will have a 20 minutes of discussion afterwards, which sometimes may take longer. And one important note is that this session is being recorded from the beginning, and we will upload it to our YouTube channel, to the VV YouTube channel afterwards. And after the seminar is done, there will be an online server which will be sent by email to all of you, so that we can get your evaluation of this presentation, so that we can improve for future webinars. And finally, I have to introduce Francesco. Francesco is an associate professor at the School of Economics and Finance at Queen Mary University of London. He is a research affiliate at CEPR and a research fellow at CREAM and ESA in Germany. His main research interests are in labor economics, applied microeconometrics, and economics of migration and of crime. And his research has been published in leading economic journals such as the Journal of European Economic Association, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Journal, and many other well-established journals. And he told me that he may go to, he is now currently in Milan, and he may in the near future go to University of Milan. So Francesco, thank you for accepting the invitation, and we are eager to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mahdi, for the really nice introduction, and for the invitation to you and your colleagues and everyone who has found the time to attend this seminar. So it will be a pleasure to present this paper. And as Mahdi suggested, I'm happy to take questions, maybe more like kind of like clarifying questions during the talk, and but also like more challenging questions. And then we can discuss it more later on. We still have a very work in progress paper, so I haven't shared it with you, and I apologize for that, but I will be, for anyone who is interested, I will be happy to send it as soon. We are working right now this week on it, so we'll be happy to share with you in as soon as I have a decent version too. So I'm setting a timer for me, and Okay, so let me start sharing the screen. Okay, so that should be that. Okay, so can you see the slides? Yeah, okay. And so this joint work, as Madi introduced, with Tommaso Frattini, is an empirical paper on border enforcement policies and flows of unauthorized migrants, and then we will talk about whether these are economic migrants, are refugees, and the answer is that we will see both of them. And so let me just give you a brief introduction. So we are facing a kind of a global refugee crisis, in the sense that we are experiencing in the last I would say 10 years an unprecedented increase in the number of the global population which is forcibly displaced, and this population, according to the latest figures available, which are for 2019, the graph refers to 2018, we have something like almost 80 million people who have been displaced by conflict, and the numbers are, so more than half of them are internally displaced, so have been forced to move away from their usual home, but they have moved somewhere else within their home country. And the 26 million are refugees, so they've moved somewhere else outside in a foreign country. And then there are like 4.2 million we are asylum seekers, so they have filed an asylum claim, and they're still waiting to know whether they will be accepted as refugees or not. And now the UNHCR is counting Venezuelans as a different group, and so we have something like now, like this is the major crisis currently. So we have something like almost 4 million Venezuelans who have moved outside Venezuela in recent years. So refugees come from the vast majority, so it's the vast majority of them, so almost 70% come from 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And clearly these countries changes over time, but the interesting to see that they are highly concentrated for a few source countries, which also suggests that addressing the crisis these countries are experiencing would be an important solution to the whole refugee phenomenon. And where do they go? So it's important to remember that about 85%, and this is a fairly constant figure over time, remain in developing countries. So they basically move into neighboring countries or nearby countries. And actually, only 16% have managed to move into high-income countries, while almost twice as much are still in the least developed countries, in the poorest countries. So again, just the distribution of refugees is really mostly in developing countries, a large fraction in very poor countries, and a relatively small fraction in high-income countries. And now we come to Europe. So this is a paper about Europe. So it's taking the European perspective about these whole issues. So I wanted to give these first 2 slides just to put the size of the phenomenon in Europe in perspective respect to the global phenomenon. So clearly these numbers are large from the point of view of us Europeans, but may look not so large if you look at it from a global perspective. So Europe has received over the last 10 years something like 5.5 million asylum applications. There have been 3.5 million individuals detected crossing the borders illegally, and I will discuss more about this in the data section. And there have been something like 26,000 estimated thousands migrants who disappeared or died while trying to enter Europe. And this graph also shows what we all know about the development of the refugee crisis and the peak of applications, of asylum application, as well as crossings, so these illegal crossings at the border, which occurred in 2015 and then dropped suddenly. And I will explain what happened in probably you know that, and basically with a deal with Turkey. So there was this sudden drop in the arrivals, okay, which is, as you have seen, is not driven by a drop at the global level. And so what we do in this paper, we really study we empirically study the European Union response to unauthorized flows at the external borders. And clearly, Europe is expected to face strong migratory pressure due to change in demographic structure in mostly in African and Asian countries, and the also development in conflict and political instability across the world. And clearly, the debate during what we call the refugee crisis in Europe was pretty much on closing borders at the beginning, and then there was a kind of a transition towards the outsourcing of controls, and so starting the collaboration with Turkey, then with Libya, and this is pretty much what we still are seeing nowadays. There is an EU agency, Frontex, which is responsible for coordinating the border enforcement at the external EU borders, and while clearly each individual member state still control their own national borders. And so the story of Europe, of the European Union, is clearly not just in migration or in many different areas of policy, is a story of a supranational institution in which coexist very different views on I would say all policy areas, and there is some agreement, but there is also plenty of conflict and plenty of priorities which are not fully aligned across member states. And clearly, when it comes to migrations, so clearly there is a national interest about, for instance, reducing the flows, which may not be the same as the interest of the European Union, which is possibly reducing these unauthorized flows overall. From a national point of view, there may be just an interest in reducing the inflows towards its own national border. So in this case, and we will talk more about this, clearly migrant diversion, so diverting the flows towards other destinations within Europe, may be something that individual member countries find desirable, while clearly it's not optimal for the European Union. So there's a tension between clearly what should be the overarching goal of a supranational institution and what are the national goals of individual member states. Including the Dublin Convention, the fact that the country which first received the asylum seekers is responsible for assessing their claims and then eventually hosting them, is clearly reinforcing the incentive for opportunistic behavior, became pretty clear during the refugee crisis. So what we do in the paper, so this is kind of like a very broad overview, but what we do exactly in the paper, we do three things empirically again. So we first show that there is evidence of political cycle in enforcement, and in the period between 2009 2015 up to the EU-Turkey deal. And then we use this political cycle, as I just anticipated, as an instrumental variable strategy to pin down the causal effect of increasing enforcement on migrant flows. And then we conclude the paper by studying because there was this transition where basically the outsourcing to Turkey became very relevant and led to that drop in the inflow of asylum seekers in Europe. And so we study what happened, what was the effect of that deal in terms of deterrence and diversion effects. And the contribution we bring to the literature and to the policy discussion is really trying to say something about border enforcement, which we think is an area where substantial resources, financial resources are spent, and also substantial political resources are invested without really having very little policy evaluation. So if you compare it with, I also work on crime, if I compare the literature on border enforcement with the literature on for instance, on police and crime, there is no comparison. So the literature on border enforcement, even if it's possibly even more expensive than some like police and crime, has received very little attention in terms of economists trying to assess how effective it is, which are the effects. And so the evidence we have is almost exclusively for the US-Mexico, which is an important setting, but a setting where you have one destination country, one source country, and one land border. And there is very little on Europe. There is, as you can see, there is now a wave, I would say, of papers, still a wave of, I would say, 6-7 papers, which have been triggered by clearly the refugee crisis in Europe, which try to look at different aspects of these issues in the European context, including some paper I have on the Central Mediterranean route. So what we do, let me first talk about the data, because clearly this is an area one of the reasons this literature is on border enforcement is underdeveloped, at least in my view, is that clearly has to do with data. Okay, so clearly, if you want to assess whether border enforcement has an effect on flows of undocumented migrants, you really need to measure both things. So one is measuring the flows of undocumented migrants, the other is measuring the enforcement, and both elements are not straightforward to measure, and especially the former. Okay, so because clearly the flows of undocumented migrants are hard to measure by definition. So the data set we assemble is a bilateral data set where we have data on illegal border crossings. So we know how many individuals were detected trying to cross member state borders at the external borders of the EU. And we know that by month and by country of origin and by route of entry in Europe. And then we built a dataset on our own, where we basically trace down all the border enforcement operations that were run by Frontex. I will clarify in a minute what these are, and so we can say on each route, on each point of time, we know how many operations with which kind of budget was spent on that operation, and then we can see whether changes in this operation affected illegal border crossings. And so these are just a map with the data for 2011, and so this is well, of the external EU borders, and we have all the different routes we will consider. So from the Western African to the Western Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, Western Balkans, and the Eastern borders. And so these are all the different routes of entry we will consider in Europe, and we have plenty of variation in over time in the routes, which are, we have variation, which is the dark line in the number of crossings with the extraordinary peak in 2015, and then we also have variation in the composition of flows across routes. Clearly, over time, some routes were more important than others, and this is the kind of variation we will exploit. So as I said before, so I'm gonna talk about unauthorized flows, and this is a mix of refugees and undocumented migrants, whereby undocumented migrants I refer to economic migrants. Okay, so as you know, in Europe, we don't really use resettlement schemes, so we don't allow, or we use it to a very small extent, so we don't allow refugees to claim asylum from their source country, from this transit country, and then get transferred to Europe. But mostly they have to physically arrive in the European in a European country, and then they can claim asylum. And so this implies that they usually come as undocumented migrants, so they get mixed with the flows of economic migrants. And if you look at the countries, at the main nationalities over this period of time, which are Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Albania, Eritrea, Kosovo, Somalia, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Tunisia, Palestine, Algeria, Iran, and Morocco, I think it's pretty evident there is a mix of countries where there is obviously a conflict, so like Syria, first of all, and so individuals who are clearly refugees, and then there are countries like the first, like Albania, where clearly is mostly economic migrants. So they come together, and that's part of the complexity, especially from a policy point of view, and I'm happy to discuss it later of dealing with this kind of flows. Then, as I said, so Frontex is this agency, and what Frontex does is basically runs joint operations. So the role of Frontex is that of coordinating the deployment of additional officer, experts, technical equipment to border areas which are experiencing migratory pressure. So what Frontex does is planning operations based on risk assessment, and then implementing the operation where they think they're more needed. And they do so as joint operations. So they ask EU countries to participate and to contribute with resources, with officers, with the means of transport. And so what we have is we have something like 365 joint operation, but our focus is on 37 land and 52 sea operations. So by land and sea operation, we mean operation at land borders and operation at sea borders. And we measure operation in 3 different ways. So we will use this indicator throughout the analysis. So we use the number of active operations. So in each point of time along each route, we know how many operations were active. Can be 0, can be more than 1. we know the total budget spent and on that quarter or month on that route, which is the sum of, if there is just one operation, just the budget of that operation spread over the duration of it, or if there are multiple operations, we sum the budgets. And then we know for how many days there was an active operation in that quarter or that month. Okay, again, if there are multiple operations, or if the operation started in the middle of the quarter, so this is just different measures of intensity. Okay, and clearly they are highly correlated, but they capture different nuances of the enforcement. So we basically carry them throughout the analysis. Okay, this is the sort of variation we have. So some routes, there is plenty of seasonal variation, but we also have like larger operations, smaller operations. So there is plenty of variation across the three different indicators. So the first one is the number, the budget, and the total days. Okay, so let me come to what we do. So we, in the paper, we have a kind of fairly standard random utility model of migration decision. And the difference, the way we change it with respect to the existing models, which are used to model the decision of migrants to go from country A to country B, is that here we only have one destination country, which is the European Union, but we allow migrants to choose alternative routes. Okay, so that's the decision is basically whether to migrate and then which route to take. And these routes clearly are different because there is a different cost of reaching a route depending on which country you are, from which country you start from. And there is different riskiness of these routes, and which reflect the fact that, for instance, crossing the Mediterranean Sea is much more risky than walking through a land border. And then there are differences in enforcement. Okay, so this is the model we have, and from that model we derive exactly the equation we estimate, which is basically this, we regress the log crossing on route R of individuals from country C in time t, on a measure of enforcement on the route, which varies at the route and time level. And then we have a battery of fixed effects, which absorb the first one, the interaction between route and country. So this capture any time invariant source country route determinant. So think about geographical distance. There is a route which is most preferred by any source country because it's closer. Then there are country time, which absorb any shock. Think about the evolution of the civil war in Syria. That's absorbed in this fixed effect. And then we have a route-specific seasonality. Gamma R, which we interact with the season dummy, which captures the fact that the same route may become riskier during winter or during the summer because of weather conditions, for example. And so what we want to estimate is the impact of beta. So a very simple question: does increasing enforcement reduce crossing on that route? And clearly we want to see whether there is an effect, and we also want to try to quantify the return of investing in enforcement. And so there are plenty of issues, which I will be a little bit brief on them, but I'm happy to discuss it further. So first, there is an issue of measurement. As I said, ideally we would like to see what is the impact of increasing enforcement on unauthorized flows. Okay, but clearly we don't observe. So no one will ever be able to observe the unauthorized flows because they are undocumented flows. Okay, so these are the flows of how many individuals are actually trying to enter Europe in any given point of time. No one knows. Okay, what we know is what we can see is the number of people who have been detected crossing. Okay, and clearly here, and this creates a challenge from a measurement point of view, because clearly if you have more enforcement on a route, you will detect more people. So there will be a positive correlation. So if I control more the central Mediterranean, I will apprehend more individuals crossing there. And I don't know whether this increase in enforcement on that specific route is also reducing the attempts, the underlying attempts. Okay, so this positive that we call detection effect may conceal the fact that I'm discouraging people. Okay, so I increase enforcement. Potentially, I'm discouraging people from crossing, but by the mechanical fact that I'm just patrolling more that route, I detect more people. Okay, and so this will lead to a positive correlation between enforcement and observed crossing that is a challenge in all this literature. And then there is a endogeneity of enforcement. So as I said, so what Frontex does is clearly it's not in the same way that police, when they try to fight crime, they deploy more policemen where they expect more crime to occur. So Frontex is doing exactly this. Is assessing potential operation based on risk assessment or risk of how many migrants will cross through that route, and they deploy more enforcement where they expect to see more migrants coming. Okay, so this is a clear case of reverse causality that basically where the expectation of higher flows will lead to higher enforcement, and therefore you tend to find a positive correlation between the two. Okay, this is identical for those of you who are possibly familiar with the police and crime literature. So what we will do to deal with this is trying to find some exogenous shock to enforcement, which is not correlated with the expected crossings. Okay, so we will and we will look into political determinants of enforcement, so decisions which have or variables which have to do with the political arena in Europe, we change enforcement across routes, but have no direct impact on the flows. Okay, and I will clarify more. And so that's the first step of our empirical analysis. So we will first document the political cycle, and then we will use that to study to go back to the initial question. Okay, so again, what we want to do is study the impact of enforcement of this variable on the attempts, but we first need to work on find something which determines enforcement, some IV, and then we go back to this equation. So now the first part of our results has to do what in the instrumental variable jargon is called the first stage, and then we will use that to go back to our central question. Let me know if there is any clarifying question. And
well, yes, there is one question from Isilda, and she wrote, quite a lot of migration through these routes is through human trafficking. Do you account for that in your model, given your model is a choice model?
Yeah, no, we don't. So human trafficking, you're absolutely right. So clearly human trafficking is there. And so there are, if you want, there are three agents in this policy game. There are the migrants, there are the traffickers or the smugglers, and there are the governments, actually the European government. And we clearly have our data allows us to see. So we tend to think, and we can discuss that the way migrants and smugglers tend to respond to changes in enforcement are fairly similar, and so we don't see it. So we are given the data we have. So what we observe is crossing, and clearly the fact that there is a crossing on a certain route is kind of the joint outcome of the interaction between migrants and smuggler and the smuggling business. So we don't look into the smuggling business simply because we don't have any data to discuss, but we clearly any reaction. So you can think that there is an increase in enforcement, and we can think that both the smugglers and the migrants have incentives to respond, I would say, in the same direction. And because the migrants wants to be able to cross and the smuggler doesn't want to be caught. So if there is an increase in enforcement, they probably they postpone the crossing, or they opt for a different route. And so, but we don't discuss it explicitly in the paper. So let me go to the first part. So political cycle in border enforcement. So here as we said, we are looking for determinants of enforcement which have nothing to do with migration, and but may shift enforcement. And so the first thing which is our main IV, is the idea of using the political cycle in the presidency of the Council of the European Union. So there is, I would say, pretty much consensus among political scientists that holding the European the Council presidency gives, in the words of this paper, it's holding a privileged opportunity to shape the EU policy agenda in accordance with national interests. Okay, so the idea here is there are national countries who have different goals, national goals, domestic goals, and whenever they can, they try to influence the European Union decision in favor of those national goals. And there are evidence, for instance, that the holding the EU presidency allows member countries to influence the budget in its own favor, or its allocation, for instance, in terms of development, in the choice of of countries that receive international aid from the European Union. So the idea we had is basically, if the current EU presidency can influence the budget allocation to operations, do we observe more expenditure on the closest routes? And the idea here is that if Italy gets the EU presidency, we can think that Italy is more interested in reducing the flows on the Central Mediterranean route, which is the route going from Tunisia and Libya into Italy, much more than reducing the flows in Spain or in Greece, because we are, I mean, the Italian government, at least to a certain extent, is self-interest. And so if that's the case, do we see that the budget allocation responds to this variation in who is holding the presidency? Okay, so the idea is that so the idea graphically is that you have this rotation, which is predetermined, is based on the alphabetical order of the countries. So what happens from the point of view of the different routes, that the different routes, which are depicted by, so the starting point of the different routes, which is depicted in this graph, more or less, happens to be closer or farther away from the current EU presidency in a way which is predetermined. Okay, so, and the simple intuition is that, okay, so there is the Central Mediterranean route. In that period of time, in that semester, Italy becomes the council president, and therefore there is more allocation of enforcement. Okay, in the next semester, someone else will farther away and becomes the president and shift the resources elsewhere. Okay, so this rotation is what we use, and we simply use the distance from the route to the current EU presidency as an instrument. So you have variation both in time and cross-sectional that we exploit as an instrument. And clearly the exclusion restriction here is that the fact that Italy, rather than France, rather than Lithuania or Greece, are the current presidents of the council doesn't have a direct effect on migration flows other than the effect through the change in enforcement. Okay, then we have a first stage to convince you that this instrument works, and it does, and this negative coefficient suggests that the farther away you are as a route from the current EU presidency, the lower is the investment in enforcement, measured with number of operations, the budget of operation, the days of operation. And the magnitude is basically 1 standard deviation increase in distance imply approximately a 0.1 standard deviation reduction in enforcement. Okay, so there is this kind of a exogenous change in reallocation of enforcement. Okay, and we can also show that the first stage is stronger. So for countries that actually are on the external Schengen border, so for Greece, Hungary, Italy, Malta, and Spain, when they get the EU presidency, you do see a stronger shift of resources towards the routes which are closer to them. Okay, and there is also an alternative ID which we use, kind of like as a robustness check. We basically use incoming national actions, and here the idea which has been documented in beyond the European Union, but in the European Union has been shown that the European Union budget, there is a stronger allocation of budget towards member countries with incoming elections, and also with especially in countries where there is a larger share of Eurosceptics. Okay, with the idea that the European Union wants to preserve itself and therefore wants to invest more into, for instance, in avoiding something like the Brexit to happen. Okay, clearly they should have invested more in the UK, I guess. And so the idea we have is basically we measure whether there is an incoming national elections in the two closest countries to a given route. So for the Central Mediterranean, we see whether there is an election in Italy, or in France, or 2, 3, 4 countries which are closest to the arrival of each route. And we eventually weighted with data on trust in the European Union institutions taken from the Euro Barometer. So again, we use that variation in the national political cycle as an instrument. Okay. And let me go straight to the second table for the sake of time. Here we basically use, so in the odd columns, we only used our election instrument, and then in the even columns, we use the election instrument together with the distance from the European presidency instrument. And so the positive coefficients on the first line suggest that if there are incoming election in the closest countries to the arrival point of the route, then you do observe a systematic increase in the enforcement. So there is more money, more effort to prevent flows in countries which have incoming elections. And instead, what we have seen before, so the negative coefficient on the second row suggests that the farther away a route is from the current EU presidency, the lower is the investment in enforcement. Okay, so using this evidence, clearly, this doesn't mean that the entire enforcement is shifted by these political variables, but what this regression shows is that there is some political cycle into it, and which we can then use in basically in the second stage to go back to our original question, which is the second part of our analysis. So here we look at, basically we go back to the original question. So we look at the crossing, we regress the crossings on measures of enforcement, and we include our dummies. So what we find with the OLS is very little. Okay, if anything, there are positive or zero coefficients. So there doesn't seem to be much. And as I said, with the OLS, clearly we have an issue of measurement, which I discussed before, and a strong issue of endogeneity of the deployment. But even with OLS, so if you don't buy at all our IV strategy, you can stop to the OLS. Even with the OLS, if we then split sea routes from land routes, what we see is the pattern we see is that on land routes there is a systematic negative coefficient, and so on increasing enforcement on land routes reduces the crossings. On sea routes, we tend to find a positive coefficient. Okay, so the main difference between sea routes and land routes really, you can deploy more officers, more the army at the border, so you manage to shut it down, and you can push back, as it's happening in the last months at the eastern borders. You can basically push back people simply. On the sea, as you know from all the debate about search and rescue operations in the Central Mediterranean, the role of NGOs, the role of this, or whether this had a pull factor or not. Clearly, on sea operation, when you stop people in the middle of the sea, you have to decide whether to push them back into transit countries like Libya or to bring them into European Union and then assess their claims. So this may create a potential pull factor, and so this positive coefficient may be suggesting that, or let's see. So we will see what happens once we use our IV instrument to deal with that. So when we do IV and column 1, 2, 3 reports our two-stage least square estimates, and then column 4 is the reduced form regression. What we see is that instead, once we deal with endogeneity, we find a consistently negative effect of enforcement throughout the board, no matter what is the measure we use of enforcement, and the magnitude is substantial. So if you increase enforcement by 1 standard deviation, you get something like 50%, 20% reduction in the standard deviation of the log crossings. And if we split again with the IV, sea and land routes, we find that a clear negative effect on land routes. So basically the IV confirms the OLS estimate. So on land routes, increasing enforcement reduced crossings, and we also find a negative effect on sea routes, although as you can see the estimates are imprecise, and therefore we cannot really say whether that's different from zero or not. But we suggest we can, given that the point estimate is negative, in our view, this suggests that we can rule out a pull factor of enforcement of operation on sea. Okay, so then we have a number of robustness checks. So for instance, this is about the timing of the effect. So what this graph is showing is that the effect is there, only there is no anticipation effect. So which is clear, you don't want to see that increasing enforcement today reduce crossing yesterday, because that would be really hard to explain. So there is no effect on the past, but also there is very little persistence. So increasing the enforcement in this quarter has an effect, a negative effect, this yellow bar in this quarter, something in the following quarter, but then the effect is not there anymore. Okay, so it's very temporary. There is no anticipation, which is a good falsification exercise. Then we can do the same exercise with the alternative IV. So these are the estimates used in the election, and we can use them alternatively. We can use them together, and pretty much the estimate, which is reassuring. So using our election IV rather than the distance from the European presidency leads to very similar estimates. If you use them together, everything works fine and the reduced form. So this is really reassuring. So our results do not depend on one of the two IVs. So if you accept one or the other, we have basically the same results. And we have we exclude peak refugee crisis, we exclude routes, we do the same leaving out one country and play around with different. Okay, so sorry, let me stop my. Okay, so let me use my last 5 minutes to talk about the last part of the paper. Sorry, no, let me say just very quickly. So we have the country of origin, and so we can try to distinguish refugees from economic migrants, and that's pretty important. So we can clearly we only know whether in the country of origin there was a conflict or not, and we can use that to distinguish whether these people are coming from countries where there is a conflict, whether are internally displaced people, whether according to the political terror scale of the US State Department, there was state terror. And we can see whether the refugees are less or more responsive to enforcement than economic migrants. And we would expect refugees to be less responsive because clearly they have much stronger push factor than economic migrants. And this is basically let me just give you the intuition for this table. So maybe for this one, so because we use alternative measures. So what we find is that clearly there is a strong response of people coming from countries where there is no terror. Okay, so economic migrants, as you would expect, reacts much more, actually react to enforcement, while we don't pick up any effect of enforcement on the crossings from countries where there is where clearly there is a conflict. Okay, so clearly, as you would expect, so the enforcement has a stronger effect on economic migrants and the refugees, which is potentially a positive finding, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that refugees are responding less, but this doesn't mean that they are not having to pay a high price in terms of risk or in terms of the price they have to pay to smugglers to manage to get to Europe in spite of the increase in enforcement. Can I use still 3 minutes of your time? And so the first part of the analysis was, if you want, kind of maybe intuitive. So we want to see whether increasing enforcement has an effect. We find this effect using the IV of political cycle in border enforcement. We have a political cycle at the European level, a political cycle at the national level to identify that. We find a stronger effect on land routes, and we can quantify that. And we can also see that the effect is the elasticity to enforcement is larger for economic migrants than refugees. But then Europe moved in 2015, Europe was really following this peak in crossings, was really thinking more and more about outsourcing, asking transit countries to step in. And this was the idea of the EU-Turkey deal, which was signed on the 18th of March of 2016. And so the idea of this Turkey deal was basically money, 6 billion euros, and lots of political promises in exchange for stemming migration. And so the question is kind of obvious. So was it effective in terms of like closing the East Mediterranean route, which is the route going basically from Turkey into Greece? And that's question we already kind of know the answer, because we have seen the peak in 2015 and then the sudden drop in 2016. But then the important question we ask is diversion. So we close the route, what happened on other routes? And the answer in one graph is this one. So these are the total crossing. Now I'm using monthly data. And the monthly crossing on the East Mediterranean. So there was an average before the crisis, in the month before the deal, of something like 130,000 individual crossing each month. And this went down to 3,000. Okay, so the left-hand graph suggested that this the policy was effective. There was a massive reduction of crossing through the East Mediterranean. The other graph is looking at the Central Mediterranean. So what happened there? So there was a clear decline, and then there was a substantial increase. Okay, the scale of the two graphs is different. Okay, notice that the Central Mediterranean scale is one order of magnitude lower than the scale of the East Mediterranean. Okay, so, and also clearly this increase may be diversion. So migrants you close this Mediterranean, the migrants went down and diverted the flows toward the Central Mediterranean. It could be something else. Okay, it could be, for instance, a sudden increase in crossing from African countries driven by political changes. And so what we do, we can exploit information on country of origin, and we can distinguish the effect of Asian and African countries. But the other factor that may explain this, this sudden increase is the fact that the deal was signed in March. And so it became effective from April, May, so going into the summer. And so clearly during the summer, you do have more crossing through the Central Mediterranean route in all years, simply because weather conditions improve and it becomes easier to cross it. Okay, so part of this uptake after the deal may be driven by seasonality. Okay, so what we do, we basically, in a different approach, we use the previous year. So we see whether in all years there is an increase in crossing after April. And then we use the comparison between African and Asian to rule out the fact that this increase was driven by African countries crossing more. Okay, let me give you, let me skip this result, let me skip the equation. So let me give you the findings. Okay, so the upper panel on the East Mediterranean, we find that for both Asian countries and African countries, the coefficient of interest is this post 2016, we do have a drop. Okay, this coefficient suggests a drop in which is basically a 100% drop in crossings, as we have seen. So no one is crossing through the Eastern Mediterranean any longer. If we then look at the Central Mediterranean, we see that the post-dummy is positive and significant. So in all years, in the period between April and September, so the summer, late spring, summer, there's always an increase in crossing in the Central Mediterranean. But after the EU-Turkey deal, there was a positive increase of crossing of Asian citizens crossing through the Central Mediterranean. Okay, and why we don't see the same for Africans? Okay, so we don't see this anything. So we do see an increase in African in all years, but nothing major happened. There was no increase in African countries after the deal. Okay, so this is strong evidence suggesting there was a diversion effect. And so people had to work, well, had to change route, but they kept crossing into Europe, even if clearly there were less crossing overall. Okay, so the EU-Turkey deal had implied a reduction, but at the same time, a diversion of flows. And this graph is just showing that if you leave out any of the main Asian countries from the sample, especially Syria, which accounts for almost 40% of the crossings at the time, you still find the same diversion effect. So this diversion effect was there it's not driven by one single country's changing routes. So the diversion effect is there no matter whether you remove one of these major Asian countries, the main 8 Asian countries which were migrating at the time. Okay, so I think I don't need to summarize for the sake of time, and I'm more interested in your question and feedback and comments more than in summarizing our findings. So I will shut up and I'll leave the floor to answer.
Thank you, Francesco, for the impressive work that you showed us. It was an interesting presentation as well. I think it will be good if you still share your slides, because maybe some people still would like to ask questions. So some people already asked questions in the chat function. I maybe ask them to join and unmute, and then maybe they can talk. So one of them is Michael, because Isilda is not able to talk, but the first is Michael. I think, yeah, it's Michael.
Okay, that's me.
Yeah, so please.
Well, thank you. It was a very exciting exercise. Well, I have 3 or 4 points. One of them actually is the same which Isilda mentioned now, but first on following up from Isilda's point, does Frontex have apprehend traffickers and therefore has data on traffickers, which one could probably then use? This is just a data question. Second, well, I think it was very nice to see how you tried to find instruments. Yes, I was also thinking of some of them are rather crude, no? Like presidency is a full half year each time, but we can see a much more dynamic pattern, no? Of crossings. And Isilda asks actually a similar question as I, how does it matter which parties or coalitions are in power in the different countries, also with this election cycle? So probably one could refine a bit more the instrumental analysis. Thirdly, well, I think the question of distinguishing, we all know that it's a continuum, refugees and economic migrants, but it would be interesting to see whether one can go further on that by basically seeing whether certain flows are more sensitive towards economic variables, basically what one normally uses in migration flows, differential in income, so some GDP shocks, and similarly labor market situations. So we can also see that on these different routes, there are compositions of migrants from different source countries. So I think you haven't used too much of differential push elements from these countries. I know whether there was a particular crisis in Pakistan as compared to Afghanistan or Iraq, Iran, and so on. So the composition of these flows are sensitive towards particular patterns which happen in the source countries. Thank you.
Shall I answer one by?
Sure, you can do that. I think it's easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's easier because I took note. These are already three very important and relevant questions. So yeah, so on the traffickers, yes, I think there are some data by Frontex and which again collects information also from member countries and on traffickers and how many of them are actually apprehended and there is something. I mean, the numbers are tiny, and so the number of traffickers which are really apprehended and then but we haven't thought about using them, and but because we don't really see how this would really change our analysis in given that I doubt we will. I mean, clearly we at the beginning of this project we looked for data on prices and which we would have loved to. I mean, there are some possibility of finding some data on prices of like crossing from one area to the other, but clearly finding something which is has time variation, cross-sectional variation, which is reliable and homogeneous and consistent is something that I would say it's impossible. So we have some data points. We know how much someone paid to go from Syria to Germany in 1 year. We know so, but these are all scattered. So on trafficking we are not doing much, although we are very interested in that part. On the IV, yes, I think it was. I mean, the IV are pretty bare and or crude, and but that's it's an intentional choice, and and then we will see how the discussion with the referee will go. But we tend to prefer to show that the IV has attraction even in its simplest possible form. And then that's why we use the variation is really the geographical distance from the capital and nothing else, without really fiddling with the data. On the national actions, I didn't have time to spend on that. We did something more, so we augment the if you want. So I briefly I'm sharing the slides, right?
Yes, we see.
Because I'm sealing this. And I will be able. So we augment our IV with data from Euro Barometer, and which we use to this low trust. We use data from Euro Barometer from the previous year to avoid endogeneity, and on low trust in the European Union and any other measure we use of Euroscepticism. Has increased actually the power of the instrument. So is it true that clearly if you have a closest election, in incoming election in a country where there is a large share of people who have low trust in the European Union, which you can think this, I would say, map 1-to-1 with populist, especially right-wing parties, and then you do see that the instrument has more predictive power. Clearly, in that case, we use this as an alternative IV because the concern is that clearly, if you had a migration shock in the past, this may trigger the election of a right-wing or a right-wing populist party, and then this may open the discussion whether this is more endogenous to future flows, which violates the exclusion restriction. So that's why we stay a bit away from that. We haven't used changes which party got elected, but we use this Euro Barometer data to add to that. So refugees, economic migrants, yes, indeed. So we observe. So let me get to the specific. So we observe any. So these two variables basically. So for you on the pull factors. So that's so the suggestion by Michael was why don't you try to see whether part of these flows react more to economic shocks in destination country to try to disentangle who is a kind of an economic migrant from an asylum seeker. And this, I mean, it's
in the country of origin, no?
Sorry?
Also push factors.
Yeah, and the push, on the pull factors, yes, this has been shown, and there are plenty of papers using bilateral data on migration and asylum seekers. I mean, the difference in our setup is that we don't have destination countries. So our data set is bilateral in the sense of being source country, route, and we don't know where they go. And so that aspect is basically absorbed by the route and the time dummies. And the push factors are in the main core of the analysis are entirely absorbed by these country times time dummies, which observe, for instance, the fact that Syria, when we started the analysis in 2009, was a country where there was no conflict until 2011, where the civil war started. And so this is completely absurd. If we remove these dummies that we do in the paper, for instance, I didn't have time, so let me scroll through the slides. But when we look at this difference in this table, which I skipped, we do remove the country time dummies. So by removing them, we can include push factors. And for instance, if we include the number of people internally displaced, as well as if we include any measure of conflict, time variant, country specific measure of conflict, this we find this positive coefficient. So clearly, if there are more internally displaced individuals in that country in the previous year, in this case, we do observe more crossings so clearly, by removing the fixed effect, we can explore the role. We can also estimate this fixed effect, and we play around with them. Clearly, if you remove them, you can assess push factors, and you do see that clearly conflict and internally displaced, any measure you have of that determines future flows. But then we observe that to concentrate on the enforcement measure. I think
Yeah, thank you. So one question also came to my mind. I think I missed it, or maybe you didn't show the exogeneity of instruments. Did you make a test on that, or for showing that the instruments that they're using are exogenous?
So well, we make an argument for the exclusion restriction. So that's a so that's the way we.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't put them in the reduced form of the equation to see if they have direct impact on the migration flows. Yeah, I think that's necessary.
Well, because there is a debate on whether that's a credible test of the exogeneity. I belong more to the school of Armas, Angrist, and so this is my UCL upbringing, whereby I believe and teach the exclusion restriction is an assumption that we make on the unobservable. So here is really about thinking whether the variation in the EU presidency has a direct effect on flows, and whether the fact that there is an incoming election in Italy will attract more migrants for that reason. And so that we make an entirely theoretical argument on that. And then clearly, I mean, what we think is pretty compelling, and that's why is the fact that we can use this instrument separately, and we reach. Sorry, I'm flying.
Well, the only reason that I mentioned it was because when the instruments are not fully exogenous, then the standard errors of the instrumented variable will be biased. Yeah. So that's the only.
Yeah, not only. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's
if
the
they're
only.
not entirely exogenous, I mean, even the point estimates are biased. So
Yeah.
And so that's clearly that's a concern. So clearly that's why, I mean, clearly with I mean there are, I would say there are different tastes on IV, and whether we clearly with IV clearly, yeah, so our instruments are fairly strong, which is a good point on in terms of, so clearly if you have strong instrument, this can counteract a little bit of a potential violation in the data of the exclusion restriction. And with respect to weak instruments, so clearly the concern that there may be something there that still is correlated with some observer that we don't observe, then is still there. And I would say in any IV strategy here, clearly we do our best to argue for the exogeneity of our instrument to the flows, and the fact that we use two of them, and yeah, we can use one, we can test because we have over-identifying restriction where we use both, we can test, and everything works fine. But and again, I think that
theoretically, I completely follow your argument, and theoretically it makes good sound to have them as instruments. Yeah, for sure. So let me go to William. William also had a question. William?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and the model that you developed was very interesting. I was wondering, when I think of some of the demographic impacts in the Middle East, I think to the Arab Spring that happened about a decade ago, or a little bit more than that. And my understanding was that technology played a big role in having kind of a pull factor for people when they moved over boundaries and different borders. I was wondering if you maybe considered the power of the cell phone that's in the market, and how that could affect migration. Because whenever I look at images from the Mediterranean, what's very omnipresent is that everybody seems to have the up-to-date technology with them as they cross across various countries and continents. So I was thinking maybe it may have been interesting to somehow use that as a variable, or maybe an instrument of some sort in your model. And maybe it may be, have you considered doing a random effects model? I think you mentioned you did a fixed effects model, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. No, I mean, your comment is absolutely spot on. So I also agree. So again, I haven't seen a paper yet, but that all the clearly flows and of migrants today have an access to information and an ability to share information, to update their information in a way which was uncommon even just 10 years ago. So clearly, all the evidence is that these refugees, they are during the trip, they managed to get in touch with their family at home, with their eventually relatives and family abroad, and learn from social media whether, for instance, Hungary closed the border, Italy closed the ports, and so they are fully aware, and so which I think has increased the responsiveness they have to any shock with respect to a past where they probably just started the trip and then without knowing what was going on. So we have thought about it, and but in this paper we thought how to bring this in, and in terms of, for instance, coverage of mobile phones. But given that the geographical nature of our data is fairly crude, so we only have this route, which is clearly a very broad area, we couldn't find a reasonable way to bring into the analysis. I have some work which is kind of parallel project on where we only focus on the Central Mediterranean. And here we developed a proper spatial analysis, where we mapped all the death of migrants and the SOS of boats, so boats in distress in Central Mediterranean. We mapped the operations, and in that analysis we are trying to think of bringing mobile coverage in and overlap that into the analysis, but not in this one. And yeah, no, I haven't. Yeah, I'm not sure I see the relationship with the random effects specification with the technology, but yeah, but so I'm not able to answer on that.
I think this is yeah.
I like the way you did the how you mentioned the political cycle. That's quite interesting, actually, because from my understanding is that many of the refugees, they don't want to stay in Central Europe. They want to instead go to the UK or the western side of Europe. That's their ultimate goal. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of a variable that you may have included to account for that kind of a pull factor as well.
Yeah, we don't. We are working now because, as I said, I mean, our data are, and that's why how we wrote the model and then how we derived the. Sorry, let me go to the equation we estimate. And so again, it's a bilateral data, but different from any kind of like migration bilateral data or trade bilateral data, where it's like from country to country. Here is from country to route. And because that's the data we have, and that's the point of view. And but we are developing, because clearly we have, at the same time, we have data on asylum seekers application, which are bilateral. We know monthly data on, so we can see who, and what we have done so far is showing that our crossing, so in aggregate, move together with the asylum application. So clearly all the Syrians that we, more or less, the Syrians we see crossing, they show up somewhere in Europe later on applying for asylum in terms of numbers. And so now we are also trying to extend this analysis and say, okay, translate, okay, what happens if I reduce if I increase enforcement on a central route, how many less application do I observe in the countries which are nearby? And this is something we are planning to do, where we can then incorporate more maybe going also back to the question from Michael before, more on pull factors in specific destination countries, because clearly with asylum seekers data, they are truly bilateral in the sense they are from country to country, and so we can bring in both pull and push factors.
So, because you also mentioned about the policy with respect to Turkey, that some financial aid was given to Turkey, and then migrants did not move anymore to Europe through that route. So what do you think about this kind of policy? Should we have more of these policies in the future for migrants who are coming to the EU or not? What's your suggestion on this?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So I think I would say it's clear that I mean, as a general strategy, so the outsourcing of border enforcement is effective in reducing the flows, and that's pretty uncontroversial. And the reason is that, especially if you outsource the work of border enforcement to countries which are less worried about human rights, and in the case of Libya, for instance, even less worried about using violence on migrants, and clearly you do get more deterrence, because basically you are increasing the level of threat of violence on individuals to a level which is which we would consider unacceptable for European Union standards. So the policy is effective because clearly you are giving up on the complexity that this. So I mean, the main complexity of these flows is that you do have asylum seekers who have a right to apply for asylum, and so we should respect that right. And then you have economic migrants for which instead you can decide as a destination country to admit or not to admit them. And the fact that you can hardly distinguish the two make this complexity very high to handle. Because clearly, if you allow them to come, you are basically respecting the human right of asylum seekers, but then you are incurring a very high cost of then sending back the economic migrants. If you prevent them from entering Europe, you are violating the human right of asylum seekers, and you're saving money, let's say, on economic migrants. So my point of view is that from a point of view, my answer as an economist is always it depends. So on the effectiveness, it is effective in the same way that if you ask the police to increase the level of violence, you may eventually get more deterrence, but there is a limit to that. And so there is a discussion which has to be done in terms of well, first of all, if it's cost effective. And so the cost of doing that goes well beyond what we pay to Turkey. So the episode of the missing chair in the latest meeting with Erdogan suggesting that there is a very high political cost of striking deals with countries that are not then gain lots of bargaining power with respect to European Union. So there is a high political cost. There is I think a very worrying humanitarian cost and human rights cost to take into account. And so my answer is I don't think is the way, at least the way it has been done. And there is a part of it. So it may be also optimal for refugees not to necessarily to move to Europe. And so it may be optimal for them to stay in transit countries, and as long as with potentially Europe paying for that. And so there are like lots of different schemes that can be thought of. But clearly, I would say that as European Union, we should really control what is done and have a control and on that, and have a say on that, and not just like assign the task to someone else and then trying to ignore what exactly they do, and in order to achieve the results of the deterrence. Exactly. Sorry, I gave a very long answer.
No, that was a very comprehensive answer. Yeah. So Michael has also.
Sorry, just clearly with Turkey, I think that clearly if you do that with a country that we can discuss how democratic it is, but still you're discussing with a more or less elected representative. But clearly, in the case of Libya, I think it's just if you do that with a country which is in the middle of a civil war, where you don't even have a proper army or to talk to, and a proper representative, where there is no control on who is using the violence. And so that's something, it should be a no-go area for me in terms of policy making.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that Michael had another question. So Michael, would you?
Well, I only wanted to come in if nobody else is.
Sure, please.
Queuing up. So no, obviously this is a very pioneering study. So the sort of overall question is, where do you go from here? Will you do, how do you enlarge a study? And I was thinking of a few points. Well, one is, you didn't include conditions also in a view how EU asylum policy is evolving. One is somehow linked to this Turkey thing, that the conditions in the transit countries are important here, because one sees more and more that there is a stock being built up here in the transit countries, or in some of the transit countries, and that people don't necessarily just the source country, which is featuring, but the country on the route in which they might stay for a long time. So in that sense, you might refine this route idea with information about transit. And from an sort of the other thing is, of course, the bilateral thing, that one looks at country to country rather than the EU. And there, I guess, the information about strengthening or weakening the asylum procedures, they're still national, basically. Yeah? Each country decides on making it easier or making it more difficult to get granted. Yeah. So I guess this affects again flows. Yeah, it could of course be that the whole EU becomes more restrictive, but I think the composition of people going to particular destination countries and their changes in asylum procedures will affect even the overall flows. But of course, if you do it bilaterally, will affect the bilateral flows. Yeah. And overall, I guess the model has something like incentives to move, which are basically push factors and pull factors. And you have deterrence, which at the moment you only capture through the EU, through the Frontex activities. But of course, there are other deterrence elements, like, as you mentioned yourself, the behavior of transit countries, yeah, on the way. But they're also facilitators. Well, if we take the sort of overall picture, well, one facilities are conditions of trafficking, but the other ones are the non-state actors, like NGOs acting here on different routes. So the model basically overall has incentive on one hand, push and pull, deterrence, and then facilitators. Yeah, and these are the three factors I would see in overall affecting the flows and costs and easiness, yeah, of flows. I just wanted to draw out from you in which direction you will go in further pursuing this analysis.
Yeah, no, it's I agree. So really the reality is much more complex. There are many more actors than as I said before, than just the migrants and the European Union. And clearly we need to simplify reality a little bit, as that's, I guess, is the job of economists, to try to say something. And clearly we are not theorists, so we are both applied. So we started from the data, and then clearly the data we have this structure. So we thought about what we can learn from this data, and therefore how we build the model. Clearly the model can be extended in all different ways, because clearly it has a specific cost of the routes. So let me go on so basically, I'm still sharing, yeah. And so the way we model, basically each route has a specific cost, and which varies over time and depends on the country of origin. So this is this cost C, and so the way we wrote the model is that there is a cost of which is increasing in the level of enforcement on the route, which is what we want to estimate. There is a measure of route dangerousness, and then there is a distance. So this is a kind of dyadic fixed effect, like in any trade model, between the source country and the route R. But then clearly here you can think of clearly the presence of facilitators or NGOs will eventually, for instance, I would summarize them as entering this age, so reduce the dangerousness, or you could have a monetary cost here, which depends on the presence of facilitators, and then you can clearly extend and complicate the model. We can do very little on that, but we feel safe on the. So I think the model can be clearly extended. And clearly, we decided that there is only one destination countries. So below you can see that the decision to migrate depends on whether the value from migration, which is basically the utility of going to the EU. But then you could clearly allow for multiple destinations within EU, which is also depends on which route you enter through. So you could complicate it in the way you in many possible ways. And we stick to the data that we have to. And on the empirical side, we think that anything which is everything which changes at the route level and time level together with enforcement is clearly a threat in terms of creating omitted variable bias. And so anything which changes, which has an impact on crossing, but also is correlated with enforcement. So we need to think about different aspects. So for instance, you mentioned national enforcement. So what countries do is something that we don't measure and which falls into the error term. And so then we can discuss whether our IV takes care of that or not, and how that affects interpretation. And we have that in the paper. So within some some of these effects that we don't capture, so changes in national legislation, changes in the presence of actors, of NGOs, or Angela Merkel unilaterally deciding to suspend the Dublin Convention, or Hungary closing the border. So all these kind of shocks, which are again not on the route, but clearly will affect some routes more than others. We think we take care of them with the IVY strategy, but others we probably not, and then they affect the way we interpret the finding, especially the national enforcement, depending on whether Frontex enforcement crowds in or crowds out the national enforcement, then this affects the way we interpret our coefficient. And that's something we discuss in the paper. We also empirically do something in respect to that. So bringing more into the analysis and to try to deal with all these possible confounding effects. In terms of where I'm going, I think I would say that the structure of this paper is where we are adding this analysis of the asylum seekers. We are bringing in measures of national enforcement, which are not as good as the one we have for Frontex enforcement. And but more or less the structure I would say is this one, I think, also because the paper is already pretty long and heavy. But as I said, I'm working on this more like this special analysis of the Central Mediterranean, where we try to answer all these questions about pull factors, the effect on the risk of death, and that's also where I'm currently going. I'm working now with the World Bank. We just finished a collection of data in Libya on migrants, on displacement, because also that's also something we are interested in, see how conflict, as you say, sorry, let me take a step back. In the paper we have on the Central Mediterranean, we bring in exactly the evolution of conflict in Libya, which, as you say, are condition in transit countries which affect migration. We bring it in the analysis to see how that changes in transit countries' condition affect the flows, and then we also, as I said, we are now collecting data in Libya on migrants and try to see how the displacement and the conflict there has affected the flows and the number of outcomes of migrants using this time survey data.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. So is there any other question, comment from the audience? Well, usually the physical seminars are much better because we can see all the people and we can see if there is any question mark on their head. But here we cannot. Yeah. So if there is no more question, I should close the session, and thank you very much, Francesco, for presenting this excellent work. And thanks also to all other people who joined, and the discussion was also interesting. So yeah, thanks a lot, Francesco. And have a nice evening, all of you. Thank you.
So thank you very much again for the invitation, and
thank you. Yeah.
Any comments, I will be happy to receive via emails, and we'll be happy to answer. So thank you very much for your comments, for your time, and let's
we will be in touch.
We will be able to physically meet. I must confess, I've never been to Vienna, so it's a shame.
It's a pity that there was this pandemic. Otherwise, we would have invited you physically here. And you could have seen Vienna. So next time.
It's something I'm very ashamed of saying, but
next time after pandemic, then.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Have a nice
Bye-bye.
evening.
Bye-bye, everyone.